Welcome back to Entraz Home Lab. This should be our last video, start to finish. However, there may be updates and other information moving forward, adding a second domain controller, setting up storage, etc. One thing that I need to mention before moving forward though, looking at the options for DC1, the one thing we really need to be aware of is auto start. This is especially true in home labs if you don't have, redundant power, clustering, failover, etc. I've had this happen to me a couple of times where I would create my home network and think everything's good, only to discover that authentication and DNS aren't working. If you run your home lab as your home network, you need to make sure your DNS and AD servers are always running. Auto start can be started later or started earlier. It's a good idea to understand what this server is being used for. As an example, you probably want your domain controllers, database servers, or Exchange, etc. to start before all other services that may rely on those servers. We can configure auto start with delay times, and of course we can disable it. Auto start though is not enabled by default, so I had to come in here and enable it, and now I'm showing you in the video. In configuring auto start, I need my domain controller to start earlier, so I'll change the value to 0 or no startup delay, and stop delay of 60 seconds. For stop action, we have the system default. Power off the VM, suspend the VM, and shut down the server. If you have systems issues and the Esxi host is being shut down or there's power failure, we have to specify what we want the stop action to be. Lastly, we have wait for heartbeat. VMware Tools allows the vhost to detect the virtual machines. This will allow the vhost to get a heartbeat from the VMs to understand what it's doing, if it's accessible or whatever. For now, I'm just going to save this and move on now that we have auto start set. In starting our vCenter server installation, we need to start our DNS server, in this case DC1. Taking a look at the DNS entries, we have a forward lookup zone, which is name to IP resolution, and of course reverse, which is IP to name resolution. Under forward lookup zone, I have the entraz.com zone created from the domain installation. I also have pre-populated the VCSA67A record with an IP address of 10.0.10.19. When any device using this domain controller attempts to ping or access VCSA67.entraz.com, this is where the IP address is resolved. We can add new host or A records for our Esxi hosts for the IP lookup by vCenter. You don't have to do this, but names are more descriptive than IP addresses. So let's create NTR Esxi01 resolved to 10.0.10.20 and another NTR Esxi02 that will resolve to 10.0.10.21. Once we have added the records, we can now see them in DNS Manager, which now I have DC1, VCSA67, Esxi01, and Esxi02. Now we can move on to the actual vCenter server DVD installation media. If you head to the VCSA UI installer, you will use this to get the graphical installation. Since I am running this on a Win32 box, I will select that folder and then open the installer application file to get us started. The Vcenter installer gives us the ability to install, upgrade, migrate, and restore a vCenter server installation. Since this is our first or new vCenter install, we choose the option to install a new vCenter server appliance with the Platform Services Controller, or PSC. vCenter server installation has two stages to it. There's the deployment of the appliance and the setup of the appliance. We must accept the EULA to continue. For the deployment type, we want to embed the Platform Services Controller. For a larger distributed or linked style environment, we may want to separate into a single Platform Services Controller and then we can link multiple vCenter servers to that PSC. We have to deploy vCenter server on an existing Esxi host. In this case, we can specify the name or IP address of the Esxi host or vCenter server that we wish this new vCenter server installation to be installed on. Keep in mind, the default HTTPS port is 443, so we just need to specify the credentials on the Esxi or vCenter host that we are going to deploy to. So we'll input 10.0.10.21. Let's just verify our IP here. Alright, we have an Esxi host, NTR ESXi02, with that IP address. I'm going to leave the HTTPS port the default, and then we can specify the root account for that target server. Keep in mind this root account is to log into the Esxi host to do the installation. Esxi hosts have self-signed SSL certificates by default. We just need to make sure the SHA-1 thumbprint is proper, and then if we accept it, we hit yes. Next, we need to specify a name for our vCenter server as well as its root password. Another big design consideration we need: what is the deployment size of the server? We have a couple of drop-down lists that specify which size we require. VMware did a nice thing here to let us know what is the configuration sizes available to us: tiny, small, medium, large, and extra large. This ranges from 2 virtual CPUs to 24, 10 gigabytes of RAM up to 48, storage of 300 gigabytes to 1,180 gigabytes, from 10 vhosts up to 2,000, and lastly from 100 VMs up to a max of 35,000 VMs. Even though I have kind of a tiny environment, I don't like to specify the minimum when it comes to operations, so I'll choose small and leave the default. We will have 4 virtual CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM, 340 gigabytes of storage, which allows us to have up to 100 vhosts and up to 1,000 VMs. Now, one of the issues we have with some of our smaller environments, especially the home labs you see these other companies use, they're usually running on systems that don't have a lot of resources to them. When you're starting to look at 4 vCPUs and 16 gigs of RAM, well, a lot of the systems might have quad core, stretching it might have an 8 core, and a lot of them don't have more than 32 gigs of RAM, so you are really pushing it with those smaller systems. Hence why I'm talking about, enterprise class servers here, because you will require a lot of resources depending on what you're learning. Just like as an example here, in our other video for FMCV, that required, 16 virtual CPUs and like 40 gigs of RAM. So keep in mind when you're doing your studying, you really need to invest a little bit into what you're learning. Depending on your log retention needs, you can also specify larger storage capacity even with the deployment size set. Log retention is always a good thing, especially if you don't have like a central log server. This will allow us to store more logs in case there's issues, we need to contact VMware, or there's any other issues that's happening. We next need to specify a data store to install vCenter on. This list will include all data stores available to the host you are installing to. We only have a single data store, so I'll leave it at that. However, we do have the ability to specify thin disk mode, which I of course always use, and we also can install VMware vSAN if we want to create a new one of those. Keep in mind vSAN requires specific licensing, so you may not have that in your home lab, but keep in mind also that vSAN is kind of painful to get up and running, but it's an awesome technology that hopefully we'll be able to talk about later. The next configuration requirement is network settings. We will specify the server's port group, as the server will have an IP address in that VLAN. I'm going to keep IPv4, and of course it will be a static address. Our FQDN, or fully qualified domain name, will be vcsa67.ntraz.com. So let's run through this part really quick. IP address 10.0.10.19, subnet mask /24 or 255.255.255.0, a default gateway of 10.0.10.1, and a DNS server of 10.0.10.10. The IP address of our domain controller running our authoritative DNS. And we'll also leave HTTP and HTTPS ports as the default, 80 and 443. We can verify all of our configuration now and move on to the deployment. Once we have completed our installation of Stage 1, it will ask us to close or continue with Stage 2. If we don't continue with the installation here, we can always go to the web address of the vCenter server to continue the setup. The management address of vCenter is either the IP or FQDN :5480. The colon allows us to change the port. If we didn't leave the default HTTPS port of 443, we would have to include that whenever we wanted to manage vCenter. For now, let's just continue on with the install. We'll be taken back to the installer application to begin the configuration of our server. We'll see Stage 1 complete, and we can hit Next to continue. For appliance configuration, we can specify the time synchronization mode. In this case, I went with my domain controllers to be the authoritative time source, so I'll select Synchronize with NTP server and specify our DC1, 10.0.10.10. We can also enable SSH, which may be unnecessary now, but it is required if you will be configuring vCenter server in high availability mode. For single sign-on, or SSO, if we have an existing SSO, we can join that here. If not, we need to create a new domain. Since I don't have one yet, I will create one now. By default, the domain is vsphere.local, though in larger environments, and if we have multiple SSO, you should really specify this to a unique domain name. After the domain name, we can specify the password for the administrator account. Keep in mind, vCenter server uses the account root, and SSO uses the account administrator. Once we have confirmed the passwords, we can move on to the CEIP, or Customer Experience Improvement Program. Like most things, I don't like my servers or applications going to the internet, so I personally uncheck this box, especially if it's in a home lab or a highly secure environment. We can now verify all of our configs for completeness and accuracy. Once we feel good about this, we can hit Finish and begin the installation of Stage 2. Keep in mind, Stage 2 may take a very long time, so a little bit of patience would be a good thing. This is also true if you're using not-so-enterprise hardware, like mini PCs, if you're not using NVMe, you have a slow network, or otherwise. One thing I was hoping for was this message. We have a failure installing Stage 2. I'm not sure if this is still an issue in vCenter 7, but as you can see, it still occurs up to 6.7. So let's go through and redo Stage 2, and I'll just run through this really quick. So I skipped the installation time, and apparently the second install worked. We can now access our vCenter server using the URL https://vcsa67.ntraz.com, and if you're clicking on the link, it includes the :443. VMware simply included this here in case you changed the default port. Once we close the dialog box, we'll be taken to the vCenter web page. In 6.7, we have the option of using HTML5 and the Flex client. I believe in 7.0 Flex is no longer supported, but don't quote me on that. HTML5 is a fantastic new UI that has been moved forward by VMware, Cisco, and other vendors. Keep in mind, Flex uses Adobe's Flash Player, which is no longer supported by many mainstream web browsers, so you may not be able to access any resources still running Flash. I believe in one of my other Cisco videos, I have an M3 server that uses Flash for SimC, so I'm out of luck. No more SimC on that server. Anyway, let's log into our vCenter server here for the first time. We need to log in with the administrator account we created previously. In this case, vsphere.local/administrator. Now we are in vCenter Server. On the left, we have containers for hosts and clusters, VMs and templates, storage and networking. We can look at the configuration of vCenter to see all the configuration settings we saw earlier. And of course, we have the menu option at the top for all other configs. You'll notice it has some of the same options as the left-hand side. Keep in mind the menu has a lot more things to it, such as administration and authentication and whatnot. Moving forward, we need to add our ESXi hosts to vCenter. Right-clicking on the server name, we have a few options: New Data Center, Folder, Distributed Switch, and Assign License. We want to add our hosts to a cluster, so first we need to create a data center. We can change the name, but for now I'll just leave it as is. Right-clicking on the new data center, we have a few more options: Add Host, New Cluster, etc. We will choose New Cluster. We can give it a name, which data center it's in, and then of course we can turn on DRS, vSphere HA, and EVC. The Distributed Resource Scheduler allows vCenter to automatically balance our hosts. Basically, vCenter will look at the utilization of our vhosts, whether it be vCPU or RAM, etc., and make a determination where that VM should go. We'll talk about this a little more later in my VMware videos. HA allows VMs to be moved to another host in case of host failure. If you have two vhosts and one fails, the VMs won't be moved and powered on automatically without vSphere HA. Keep in mind things like vSphere HA and DRS do require either vSAN or remote central storage. Having local storage for all your VMs and appliances, this will not work. If you have all of your VMs or certain VMs on a local storage and that vhost fails, you most likely just lost the entire installation unless you have an external backup solution. EVC, or Enhanced Vmotion Compatibility, a little background on physical CPUs is needed. If a VM is on a newer processor with features unavailable to an older server in a cluster, the VM will not be able to be live Vmotioned. The VM will need to be powered off, moved, and then powered back on the other server. EVC allows administrators the ability to basically disable newer physical CPU functionality, allowing VMs to be Vmotioned between different generations of CPU without them needing to be turned off. When dealing with CPUs, it'd be a good idea to understand what the servers in your cluster contain. If you have a Gen 1 Intel CPU and you want to have it work on a 5th gen Intel CPU, there's probably going to be some issues there and EVC might not even work. DRS and HA require licensing to use. Considering I don't have licensing for DRS, I will just leave that off. However, I will enable HA, as automatically Vmotioning a VM off a dead host is a good idea. The problem, of course, I'm installing on local storage. So I really should have remote central storage such as iSCSI, NFS, or Fiber Channel in order for Vmotioning to be much easier. Next, we can add hosts to this new cluster. We can add an ESXi host via name or IP. You'll see in a moment why the DNS setup was important, so I'll specify NTR ESXi 01 and 02. Along with adding the hosts, we have to accept the certificate SHA-1 thumbprint here. We have a host summary. We can assign a license if we have them in here, and we can configure the lockdown mode if we want that set as well. Once the ESXi vhosts have been added to vCenter Server, you'll see them on the left. Keep in mind, the name of the ESXi host is based on how you added them to vCenter. Since I used the domain name, or FQDN, that's what you see here. You will also notice that vCenter is showing the VMs pulled from those ESXi hosts. On the right, we can see the hardware resources available depending on what's selected: host, cluster, or vCenter entirely. Clicking on VMs, you'll see DC1. Moving over to ESXi 02, you will now see vCenter Server. Clicking on the cluster, you'll notice the numbers on the right are now including both Esxi host and the resource counts. If we go back and click on VMs again, we will see both VMs because both are in the single cluster. If we click on data stores, here you will see both data stores. One very good thing to do, especially with local storage, is to rename the local data stores to something a little more descriptive. Otherwise, you may have problems later on determining which data store belongs to which host. So I'm going to rename the data stores to local underscore ESXi01 and ESXi02, so you see it's easier to tell them apart and you know which one you're working on. We can look at other things such as networks as well. The nice thing here, if you're planning on running DRS in Vmotion, you need to make sure those standard network port groups are on both hosts. So you'll see here that we have the default and servers on both. Take some time to look around at all the information and options available to you. Lastly, if you go home from the menu, you get a nice dashboard of information. Physical CPU, memory, and storage, both used and free. VM information, the hosts, and other various information below. So that's pretty much it for our home lab. We configured a network device allowing network access with VLANs. We installed Esxi on 2 vhosts. We then installed a domain controller allowing for us to install Vcenter Server. Now once again, keep in mind you do not need a domain controller for Vcenter Server, just a DNS server. But if you're making a home lab, it's a good idea to make sure you have all of these items here. Domain controllers, vCenter servers, Linux boxes, etc. So now we have our productionist home lab. This basic setup and continued perusal will assist greatly when talking with other IT people or even with recruiters and hiring managers. If you take the time to go through all of this, that is experience. Don't let anyone ever take that away from you. If you create your home lab, you do it the right way, you try to make it as enterprise as possible. You can go in there and say, hey, yes, I created 2 Esxi hosts, a domain controller, worked with DNS, and I installed vCenter Server, configured a cluster, and added storage, or whatever you say. That is better than nothing at all. A lot of these items can be done really easily and not that expensive, to be honest. If you're looking to get into IT, my personal recommendation is look at everything I've done so far. Do you like networking, servers, virtualization, storage? Once you find out what you like to do, you can set up a home lab like this, a single Esxi host with multiple Linux servers, domain controller with various Windows servers, Windows desktops, Linux desktops. I mean, there are so many things that you can do. And like I said, Entraz is training as a service. If you don't want to set up your own home lab, you know, we can provide Microsoft Windows Server, and we can provide any Ubuntu or even Windows 10 environment if you want that. We are trying to come up with a way for people to be able to learn and use VMware as a service for all of our, training and whatnot. Hopefully we'll be able to get that moving a little bit more when and if I, get anyone following me and helping me out with the videos and whatever I'm making. So yeah, if you like what I'm doing, make sure to like, subscribe. If you want to help me out, a couple of options on www.entraz.com. If there's anything you want to see progressed with this home lab, like a second domain controller or whatever else, hit me up. Respond to any one of these videos on YouTube or support@entraz.com, tim@entraz.com. Once again, NTRAAS. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.